Alright, hello. So it's Monday, February the 17th. I'm making another video today, as you can see, and I have a different kind of approach today. Um, it's actually not new for this channel, in that it's not the first time I've decided to record some videos which are not maybe more meta in the sense of like zooming out and looking at the whole thing that I'm doing and some of the questions around it that come up. Or not really. I mean, I not really like. There's certain conundrums. Basically, there's a certain problem that I try to solve by practicing astrology, uh, by putting a certain amount of energy into doing divination work, or sometimes that's doing charts for people. Sometimes, more often, that's just me recording funny videos to put on YouTube or whatever. And I have a certain kind of I try to have an well. I mean, I have a you could say it's my Sagittarius placements. I have a certain optimistic attitude or something like that. But there is a underlying issue that has recently been addressed um, around what we would call Doomerism. There's actually I just recently discovered another astrologer who I was familiar or not previously just unaware of. This person was not on my radar at all, and this person has recently done a series of videos about Doomer astrology, and I am just recording this right now as a kind of a raw, unedited video blog kind of thing, rather than making it into something that I'm going to edit and put a lot of time into or something like that. But basically, just to sort of express what's on my mind pertaining to this, and I think that this has a um, there's a certain kind of dynamic here that I find kind of relatable, and to get into it first, I'd like to address basically the whole issue of Doomerism to begin with, and then maybe I'll bring in the astrology. And there's a certain dynamic too, I think, with the way that astrology fits in with the New Age scene, and that I have my own sort of if parts of me which are more inclined to trying to be optimistic or having a positive attitude, and that there's a certain kind of like inclination towards positivity that often goes with the New Age scene, and there's also a certain doomer tension. I just want to address that because it's sort of something that I've been trying to work through for. I think a lot of us obviously are trying to deal with this one way or another. So I'm just going to try to approach the issue around this, and I think most of us are probably most familiar with this kind of this meme association of like the doomer being a guy who's wearing all black and has like a toque and is smoking a cigarette and has like the sad eyes or whatever, all right? And there's a kind of associated with a kind of like bleak, kind of nihilistic, cynical attitude towards life. And there's this idea also, there's another variation of that, which is the doomer bloomer, which is a person who has kind of gone through some sort of a stage of like depression or bleakness and has sort of come out the other side, or even if they haven't completely transformed, that they are at least finding certain, that maybe they'll have a lot of house plans or something, right? Or maybe they'll have like the bloomer thing comes out that you're a doomer, but you also have something that you worth appreciating, or a source of optimism and enthusiasm in the midst of the circumstances. And maybe that kind of resonates more with when people want to create these sort of like hashtag aesthetics. You've got like solar punk, for example, right? Like there's a certain kind of which is in denial of a certain maybe dystopian or post-apocalyptic or whatever environment, but trying to find a optimistic attitude through it. But there's still, I don't know, to wind it all back. There's a certain kind of doomer aesthetic. I think that there's a certain aesthetic reality to doomerism that, for me, I associate this with stuff like being like art school, sort of like postmodern cynicism, or a kind of left. There's a certain style of left wing doomerism that I think the political dichotomy of right wing versus left wing is something that factors into the equation, at least how I see it, because in my experience, there's a typical thing where in the urban center, you're going to experience more of the urban core has this more of this bedrock of support for the left wing, and part of that is I think there's a certain cynical attitude that comes from it, and which is multifaceted. For one thing, the left wing typically loses more often than not. And so there's a kind of thing where even if you're on the left and you've had, like, for Americans, they're enthusiastic about Bernie, they have to go through that whole process of Bernie not winning and Bernie not being a viable candidate and not really being keen on Kamala, and they're basically being there's a cynicism being based like, it's not like there is, you have enough people that could be enthusiastic, but that enthusiasm isn't enabled to go anywhere, and you feel basically cynical. You have all this negativity because you don't have any, you're sore losers, or you don't have any political agency to express yourself in the political system, right? Now, the thing is, as a Canadian, it's maybe slightly better, or at least as a West Coaster, the NDP, the left-wing party in the West Coast, at least has been winning the last couple of elections, and I feel more optimistic as a left-winger for that reason. And there were also, I think there's encouraging things, more optimistic. So it's not, I don't want to completely make the doomerism left-coded, because there are also certain kind of doomer-bloomer leftist political alignments, political goals, such that are maybe, more associated with environmentalism, where in my own personal experience, I met some people who were involved with Ferry Creek protests while I was living on Vancouver Island, and there was where I live, there's certain leftist tension, because you may have what is good for the workers, what is good for the economy, and then what is good for the environment, and what happens when those things are at odds with each other. And there could be a certain kind of a sentiment where people are concerned about the environment and sustainability and all this kind of stuff, but they want to preserve the environment, but they don't really care about people whose jobs are based around forestry or mining or all this kind of stuff, and how that factors into these international trade pressures or whatever. And so there's this kind of thing where previously there's this tension where the NDP was more in support of forestry, but they had to make deals with the Green parties. But recently they're making more deals to protect these contested areas where forestry is an issue, right? There's a certain kind of the doomer-bloomer attitude. And the other part of this is the conservatism and associating optimism with a kind of, there's like this idea of like an economic, or if you think about, like the idea of positivity and negativity and stuff like depression or whatever, these states of things that we could approach this from different kind of vectors and different angles, right? There's the psychological factor of the doomer as a state of depression or a state of negativity or a state of like learned hopelessness giving up, dropping out, having a cynical attitude about life and situation you're in. But then positivity having to do with opportunities for growth, opportunities for self advancement or development, or all the, but there's this, it's usually tied into this whole idea of capitalism and profit. And there's one of the things that one of the person who's been influenced on me is this guy named James Hillman. If you own James Hillman books, you may recognize that I have a section of books around here that are all James Hillman books. And one of the things that James Hillman talked about was the capitalism of the ego, right? And there's this idea that there's a couple different forms of this. One of the ways that it comes out is that the language that we use to talk about economics, we talk about depressed economy, we talk about currency going through inflation, right? We talk about recession, almost as if it's like the idea that like maybe in a developmental model, a person goes through periods of growth, and then they go through periods of maybe regression, right? But we have an economy that could either grow or recede, right? Go through different booms or busts, suffer through periods of depression, go through different maybe periods of stagnation where there's not as much growth. The economy could go through periods of inflation, currency inflation, increased costs of living, where there's more of a demand for a kind of increased pace of busyness, right? Where Mania is often described as a kind of a manic inflation, where there's an increased sense of busyness, where the person has to be always on, always active, always productive. And this could be because daddy's got to eat. You got to keep making that dough to put the bread and cheese on the table. If you know what I'm saying, right? So there's a kind of the manic inflation. The economy can go through manic periods of inflation or stagnant periods of depression, all this kind of stuff, and we are trained to associate have an intimate connection between our own psychology and the market, whether the market's doing well or not, and our own role in that in terms of being a productive force of economic activity. There's a whole kind of like the idea of libidinal economics with Wilhelm Reich, which later got taken up by like Deleuze and Guattari in the sort of post-Freudian, Lacanian kind of direction. So there's this whole kind of thing about the doomer being related to there's periods of economic depression and there's periods of economic productivity, and that one of the problems around Doomerism is like positivity is very much linked into this idea of having a positive attitude about making money and about being productive, about being a viable economic force. And that ability to make yourself into a viable economic force is then also linked in to this kind of like daddy subjectivity, right? Which is basically the daddy subjectivity is based on a kind of developmental psychology model saying that we develop our superego structure, if you want to go in the Freudian direction, that we have our ego, but we have this idea of a whole system of what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what we should be like, what we shouldn't be like. And there's this kind of like the superego as a kind of like a father figure or a role model, or our relationship with authority, that if we want something, if we have desires, but our desires are maybe just to eat junk food and candy, and then we start to have this relationship to an other as the one that mediates, saying, no candy before dinner, you should eat your vegetables, you should get exercise, you have this sort of, you build up this parental, and then with our parents aren't there, we have this sort of like, we develop an internal family system where we have these parental kind of figures which are there to tell us what we should or shouldn't do, and then these little needy little children who are trying to push us around and manipulate us with different desires and stuff like this. And so in this kind of thing, the idea of optimism, right, is very much linked in with a optimistic kind of proactive, Jungy father figure, which creates a subjectivity of a superego that tells the man to be a breadwinner, to be very productive, to make a lot of money, to provide for children. And this is basically because there's this idea that the economy, this could be good for the economy because you have more mouths to feed, you have more local people that are producing goods and services and basically that if you are see yourself as an agent of economic growth, then there's a whole system which wants you to do that and then confirms that subjectivity, right? And there's a similar way where what I notice is that, like, if you are, if there's a certain kind of, I don't know, an ideology or something like that, right? And that if you are situated with a bunch of people who share a certain kind of ideology, that, you know, you could be, there's a certain question of what is accurate and true, or what is basically towing the line of the ideology, or even if you're just learning something and understanding something, right? Like even if I don't agree with somebody like Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung, there is, like, I could understand what their perspective is even if I don't agree with it, right? So there's this kind of thing that if you're situated with, like, if you're going to be part of a group collective, that there's a lot of energy being invested into reinforcing a certain kind of approach, a certain kind of attitude towards things. And then the more you're involved in that, and the more that you contribute to what is already going, then what you start to do is you start to receive these intuitive yes signals, right? That you are, because there's the sense of agreement, of agreeing with something that feels good because it's gratifying, that there's something there, that there's a bunch of people who have a more positive attitude in life, and that not only is it positive, but they're surrounding themselves with a whole bunch of other people that reinforce the same thing, and a whole bunch of messaging systems that reinforce the same thing. So that when they enter into the world, they're not experiencing so much friction. Instead, they're basically experiencing a world that reinforces their subjectivity, right? And so this basically is an experience of positivity. But there's a sort of basic thing where there's always going to be the element of an other, right? That there's going to be an element of an other in contrast to that, in the same way that when you were a little child and if you just wanted to eat candy, but your parent thought you should eat broccoli instead, and you had some idea that you didn't like broccoli, that broccoli was associated with an other, and the thou shalt eat more vegetables associated with this parent figure that is like you don't identify with that idea, so you see that thing as being outside of you, and so you see that as a kind of a hostile authority, right? You start to see this kind of thing as self is me being kind of like a baby who like if like a little baby wants to be happy, to just basically, it's sort of like surrounding yourself with yes men that comfort you and that reinforce your sense of being a good person, and that anything, so you have like a little comfortable, little like safe and cozy space, and that anything which is other is taken to be negativity that is threatening that subjectivity. Or it's either a negativity in the sense of an antagonist from the outside who's dangerous because it's an unknown thing that you're not familiar with, or it's an authority figure which is linked into, and it's not just this whole thing about like, this authority figure which is suggesting a good to you that is, if you have, I'm just using this candy versus vegetables as an example, right? That if you at some level take it as you identify with the desire to eat candy, and it's some external other that wants you to change for your own good, but you resist that and you externalize it, and to you it's sort of like treated as like, you know what I'm saying? Like there's something about like maybe I'm off on a tangent here. I feel like this is this getting away from the whole topic of being a doomer about like eating your broccoli versus, because like eating your if you're eating good things, like that's sort of, this is the whole thing. It's like, you think, let's bring us back to doomerism. There's a certain kind of nihilism that is like, you know, there's no meaning to life, so who cares if you eat candy or if you eat broccoli, right? Who cares? And this is interesting because it gets into this thing about health and health moralism, right? In that there's a certain kind of the superego structure, which is a kind of a moral. It's not just that, you know, you could take from an amoral point of view, you could talk about science, right? And, you know, I was just listening to some old, some guys from the hippie era, Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, a couple of those dudes in a recording. And one of the things that Alan Watts was suggesting was that when it came to good and evil, the early definitions of evil were really just saying that certain things would be advantageous or disadvantageous in certain situations, and it wasn't more of there's more of a utilitarian almost attitude of good and evil. Like, we're just trying to create a practical sense of, like, if you're trying to live and have a decent life, then these are the things that help that, and then the evil things are, they're just, it's just, if you eat all candy, if you eat lots of candy and you get lots of cavities and your teeth fall out, and then you get stomach problems, versus if you eat the things that are actually good for you, it's just advantageous if your goal is to have a healthy body and live a long life. And, live. But I think it's kind of funny. Alan Watts is a guy who died early because he smoked and drank too much and partied too much, right? So there's this kind of question about, if you decide, there's a certain thing is that relative to the goal of longevity and health and all this kind of stuff like that, there are certain things which are conducive to that and certain things which are not conducive of that. But there's a certain kind of inherent moralism that makes it into a moral issue, or that makes it into a kind of a moral failing if you're making unhealthy choices or something like that, right? And so there's a certain kind of like Doomerism can come into this, because there's a certain attitude, or however I relate to it anyways, right? I'll go maybe get into a little bit of my own history with this, where I'm coming from it, what it means to me, is that I'm pretty open about the fact that I've had some mental health stuff in the past, and I may as well just be open about my diagnosis. Why not? I often avoid it, but like, my diagnosis is more on the bipolar, mania, schizoaffective ballpark of things. And there's something about the state of psychosis that the whole thing about it is that, personally, there's a whole other can of worms to do with the psychiatric side of it, but I think it does relate to, let's say, going into topics around Doomerism, in terms of, usually Doomerism is associated with something like depression, right? Or a kind of like dissociate, like a lot of times people get into this dissociative depressive state where they're shut down, they're numb, they don't feel anything, and they're cynical, or they end up having some kind of, in that sort of circumstance where that's what you've got going on. Where if you're a depressed person and you're a doomer, then you are just like, you become addicted to things like video games or stimulating stuff because the idea is that you're dead inside and you just need really stimulating stuff to make you feel something. But the more you overstimulate yourself, the more numb you get, and the more numbed out you are, and you just need more extreme things to stimulate you to make you feel something, right? And what's interesting is that I've noticed that in terms of to bring this back to the topic of Doomer astrology, there's a certain tendency in the way that we make content that has to, where people are making, there's certain really they call it dopaminergic, where it's really like lots of stimulating stuff going on. And it's the idea that if people are really either really depressed or they have ADHD and they can't pay attention, that they need lots of like stimulating graphics and animations and sound effects and things, having information condensed down into like really short TikTok things. And this is because like they don't have the wherewithal to focus on something for a longer period of time or something. Or it could be that people say that they're too busy, right? And that they have to keep up a kind of this like manic intensity to like be busy all the time to keep up with the cost of living for the sake of their survival, and they don't have attention for anything. But then in this sort of like state of hyperactivity, all they can consume is little like fragments of information, right? So there's certain things that there's a certain manic kind of standard of productivity, and then there's a kind of like there's a depression that like is when you're depressed, you're shut down, right? You're not as active when you're depressed. You don't do as much when you're depressed, right? So there's something about the bipolar, when you're talking about bipolar mania, there's a certain thing about, it's not about being depressed, it's about being too active, and it's about being too, you have this creative charge that instead of actually being shut down, you actually have this will to produce, you have this will to interact, you have this will to do things, you have a creative force, you have a creative capacity that doesn't want to shut itself off because it feels better to be in that creative flow. And so like that, the bipolar mania psychosis is more to do with that. But there's this problem of the in that state, there is the psychosis that actually got me in trouble was more to do with experiencing the affect of terror, doom, fear, all that negative. But there's a sense of like there's a lot of things happening. I was trying to make sense of what was going on. There's certain things happening around that time, like let's say the earthquake in Japan with Fukushima, right? There's like the Arab Spring, there's Occupy Wall Street, there's all this stuff. After I got hospitalized the first time, I went and visited some people that, it was interesting because part of this whole thing too for me was that I started living this lifestyle in Australia, and a lot of it could be possible that I was already like crazy in Australia, but it was just that the environment of being like a backpacker, doing my own thing in Australia, sort of facilitated a certain kind of way of being in the world, and that way of being just was not compatible with being back at home in Canada, my home territory. There's a whole different way of being that you get to experience as a foreigner, as a backpacker, as a migrant even, right? But when you're in your own home turf, it's just there's this kind of thing where part of my psychosis was really just a frustration with life as a Canadian, right? And that is not what I'm starting to realize as I'm working out these problems is that this frustration isn't really even necessarily personal, but it could actually have, in the same way that I described earlier about how the capitalism of the ego is like you're depressed. Are you depressed? Are you inflated? Are you in growth period? Are you regressing and recessing? All this kind of thing. Like it's very much like the mentality of being the excitement and fun of traveling just being a person in that context where certain things are possible that aren't possible if you're just stuck in your usual, life situation. There's a certain there's something about Canada, the economics, the libidinal economics, your which is the connection between your desiring production system, how you formulate your desire or your will, what you want to do, your own autonomy and your sense of direction, and your what actions you are taking in life to try to how you are developing your sense of what goals you want, is linked into this whole economic system, which makes anything doable in terms of, you know, being able to make money and have a certain creative potential to do different things in life, right? So there's a certain idea that the part of that is connected to the not personal with what your potential is, but the circumstance that you're in as a Canadian. And there's this idea of success being something that is inherently uprooting if you're a Canadian, because to use an analogy, like if you're like an athlete, like a hockey player, and if you have any talent at all, what happens is you're gonna get drafted. There's gonna be some hotshot coach in like Sweden, and you're gonna fly to Sweden and train with some, and they're gonna fly you over here, and then you're gonna get signed up to play for the Florida Panthers. You know, like, there's a certain thing where and this is basically to sort of normalize this behavior where like you have what is considered the default male subjectivity is like whatever they try to encourage as your sense of what's normal is to be like a sports dude, and there's all this stuff in there that is sort of subconscious in that we don't question. You know, presumably you could also have a different arrangement for sports where you had like Team Canada versus Team USA, and it's all kind of based on where you're born or what this kind of stuff, but you know, you're a free person who is able to go anywhere, immigrate, get hired on by somebody else, and it's basically this idea that Elon Musk tries to promote with meritocracy, is that if you have talent, there's no need for you to be stuck in some, you know, place where there's not very many economic opportunities. There's like, if you develop yourself as a certain skill, you have a certain talent, that people will just hire you and you'll go somewhere else, right? So, but this ends up being like, if this is the situation, there's a certain thing called brain drain, and it sort of is like this, creates a situation where everybody that has talent ends up going somewhere else, and what you're left with is a environment defined by a lot of people that don't have talent, that are really just kind of unsuccessful and resentful or something like that, or people that are able to find their success in ways that has less to do with being intelligent, being creative, and more to do with being sort of advantageous at exploiting different factors of inequality over, let's say, things like housing, right? Like, let's say you've got a lot of people that, because of this whole brain drain factor, all the good paying jobs are somewhere else. So when you start reaching this like pay grade where you can make a lot of money for yourself, you're going to start getting offers to go to all these other places where the big companies are set up, right? So as soon as you can make more money, you're off somewhere else, right? And so this creates this thing where there's if it's a pay ladder, there's this whole kind of like the lower pay grades, there's a huge competition for housing, accommodation within those areas, because as soon as you get up to the top, you're going somewhere else, right? So because of this, there's this idea that like, because there's so much competition, it's like you got to like factor in the market economics of supply and demand, that you've got short supply, you got a large demand, meaning that when there's a big demand, low supply, you can charge whatever you want, because you're going to have a lot of people who are competing for the same thing, and if this guy won't pay this price, then you've got 10 other people, and you can just keep jacking up the price and then making everything more and more and more and more expensive. And then everybody else has to be like, well, shit, man, I have to get out of here. I have to go somewhere where I can either afford to live, or I have to make more money so I can afford to live here. But as soon as I start to make more money, I'm gonna go somewhere else anyways, right? So the only people that are around here are basically so there's this kind of thing of like there's a sort of like, so we're in this situation which is inherently frustrating, but we're just sort of, for some reason, it's not up for discussion. It's not up as something, because I mean, what tends to happen, like, people don't want to discuss this because they're like, yeah, it's a frustrating thing. When I talk about this thing which is frustrating, I feel an emotion of frustration, right? And which is interesting because if you go into this sort of yin-yang thing, frustration is actually a yang force. Like, the thing about, you go into like bipolar mania as a yin-yang thing, where a depression is yin, a shutting down of activity, a sense of helplessness, a sense of not being able to do anything. A yang, a frustration, is like feeling like you've got a active potential, a creative problem-solving ability, a kind of an optimistic wanting to engage, wanting to problem solve, wanting to do things, but being frustrated because there's some kind of obstacle that when that creative force hits the obstacle, there is resistance, and that resistance can be conflict, and if that conflict is considered to be violent, aggressive, or hostile, it's considered to be dangerous, and that whole thing is then considered to be it's a different kind of negativity, because if you can use, the idea is that if you can use reason, and you can use the ability to rationally make an argument and to present certain things that actually improve the situation and be helpful, it's considered to be a good thing. But for some reason, there's this sort of like there's a sense that people don't like. There's a certain positivity. There's a certain positivity that's there, that is what am I? I don't know. I'm just going off the top of my head with this, right? What I'm trying to say is there's like, I often relate more to being manically positive than the depressed kind of doomerism, right? But there's this kind of, what I'm also trying to say is that there's something about the this. I mean, I haven't. Last time I was in a hospital for psychosis was 2012, and there is but this is the whole thing, is that there's a certain kind of like, in a state of depression, you're shut down, you're inactive, you're unproductive, you're not doing anything, and the state of mania, there is a creative potential, but there's a sense of frustration, and so that creative potential can easily turn into hostility, can easily turn into anger, can easily turn into these outbursts and stuff like that. And so there's this kind of idea that there's a danger in that part of the frustration or anger, or basically, I mean, the whole danger is really in violence, and this is why the unfortunate problem with mania and psychosis is that there's stigma around it, that people with this kind of condition are seen as more dangerous, because they're more likely to feel frustrated and you know what I'm saying? Like, rather than just being shut down and depressed and not doing anything, they're more likely to feel frustrated and wanting to like vent their frustration or express it, or to try to find some way to like work through the obstacle, right? But there's some kind of like the and the funny thing here is that how do we define what the obstacle is, right? Because something about this whole thing is that when you go take it back to this sort of like what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain economic, or there's a certain thing where we take all this to be personal, but it could just be that if you're in a situation where the only economic opportunity is just going to take you somewhere else, and that everything's just going to be expensive, and that you're under this sort of like, you're into this pressure cooker where you can't do fucking shit unless you find made a lot of money, and then as soon as you make a lot of money, you've sold your soul to some sort of economic engine, and now like you're gonna join the Amazon super tower or something. I don't know. Like there's something like it's like we take all this personally, but it's the circumstance that they put you in, where it's like they want it to be so that you're like, the rat who's chasing the piece of cheese in a rat maze, where like there's obviously incentives to go one way and disincentives to go other ways, and they want if you're traveling in along the rat maze in the direction that they want to make sure there's all these cheese things to make it feel gratifying and rewarding, and that you're reinforcing that you're doing the right thing, and you're going, and then we call this positivity, right? But the thing is, like, there's something about this where you're just by turning yourself over to be an agent of this sort. It seems a bit manipulative. Obviously, right? And there's this kind of like idea of just growth for the sake of growth, or the idea of the idea that why can't you be satisfied with less or something like that? But the thing, there's this whole thing about making a video to put online, in that there's a certain standard that's been set where you don't want to make your video, your message that you're putting out to other people, saying that if you're poor, if you don't have stuff, you have to just accept that you don't have any money, or accept, like, if you're somebody who wants to it's like there's somebody out there who like wants to have children, and they are like, I want to have kids, but I just don't think I can afford it, so I'm just not going to have kids, and I'm then, because my true desire is to reproduce and to be like a good parent and stuff like that, and I have to repress that biological drive, I'm depressed or whatever, right? Like, if that is the dynamic, why is it that you've got this idea that the only way that you can be happy is through having children or having a family or by reproducing, and that when you think about your actual lived experience and the different people that different families different parents, and there's lots of different situations, lots of things that worked out, didn't work out, divorces or different problems, and that there's a lot of things where people might have mental health issues, whether that's being depressed, or you could be like, I'm depressed because the economic situation is depressing, it doesn't make me feel like I can do the things I want to do. But then there's also this thing where, like, if it is that it's all about like being a parent, reproducing, doing what you're told to do by the economy, reinforced by everybody to say that this is the thing that you ought to do. And if you actually do that, then why is it that people get things like, why do women get postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis? Or why do people have, I think there are a lot of people who may be parents and they're still not happy with life. They still go through periods of depression. They still have all the mental health challenges. They still have, so it's like not like doing all the thing that you're reinforced to do, and even if you're productive in society and contributing and stuff like that, it doesn't seem like, it's like we're constantly told that that's going to be the thing that answers the problem, but what if it isn't, right? Or what if there's a certain, what if the Doomerism that looks at, there's a certain kind of exact climate problem or environmental problem or problem to do with waste or overconsumption and all this kind of stuff. And there's all this kind of stuff where, from the perspective, like, maybe if a certain line of how you define success could define me being somebody who makes a lot of money, producing a lot of stuff, selling a bunch of things, contributing to this whole machine. And it's like, if you just fall in line with the way that it runs already, it's a lot easier than trying to radically, make it better. But then you could just be becoming part of the snowball of this problem that's just snowballing, that we're and told is supposed to be positive. But really, what if that's just producing a whole bunch of garbage? It's a whole bunch of junk. That the growth is unsustainable, right? Or there's also this kind of funny argument to do with like, Malthusianism, or like this idea that like the population the population growth that's happened since World War II with the baby boomers onwards or whatever, where we've gone from, the population's almost doubled. It's kind of crazy, right? But there's apparently it's it's funny if you look at the energy consumption in I was listening to a Buckminster Fuller lecture the other day, and Buckminster Fuller was suggesting that, I guess at the time, I don't know when this was recorded, but he was 85 years old at the time, and he was saying that he noticed a direct correlation between the increase of electrical power consumed by a nation and the decrease in the birth rate. And him basically saying that the more that this kind of technology and industrialization transforms the world and brings everybody up to a different standard, what you start to see is that people who are at the standard have lower birth rates, and there's less of this drive. Because if you think about the idea of what machines, if you think about like if you had to wash all your clothes by hand, right? Think about like you're a mother in Africa and you have no electricity and you just do all this scrubbing by hand. That if you have more children, on one hand there's more clothes to scrub, but then you can train the children to wash clothes themselves and actually just help you out. And so this idea that as you reproduce more, the children or more people equals more labor power. And so there's once you get a washing machine, you don't need to have a little child washing stuff for you all day. Now you have a machine that can do it, right? And so that the more we have a industrialized, automized society, it also means that there's less demand for workers, right? There's less demand for everybody to have a job all the time, right? And so there's this kind of idea that like the more that our technology increases, there's going to be less of a demand to have lots of kids, right? However, what's interesting right now is there's a certain thing mixed up in the politics around being either if you're a doomer leftist, it means that you have a negative vision of the future, and because of this, you're like, why do I even want to have kids if it's going to be like Mad Max? Wouldn't it be more ethical if we're just heading into some Mad Max post-apocalypse scenario? What's the motivation for having a family if they're just going to be raped and murdered by hooligan gangs of criminals? If we're just descending into that kind of chaos, right? If you want to go there, that kind of level of doomerism. Whereas on the right wing side of it, there's a certain thing where you're basically using whatever opportunity for economic growth to reinforce your sense of being a provider for a family, and so that you're business oriented, and that if you can make money and you can make a business for yourself, then that means that you can afford to have children, basically, even necessarily with multiple partners, because like basically if you are productive enough, if you can make enough money, then it's not amoral to have lots of kids with multiple women because you can provide the child support payments, right? And so this is why you see people like successful images of what it means to be a man being like that Huberman guy, where it's like if you become like the Giga Chad is to like have, just have lots of women that you can, and also being like having this sort of like kind of a pro-natalist attitude where you're not trying to avoid. This is what's kind of funny is that there's a kind of like the conservatism. There's a lot of this sort of weird reproductive politics in the 2025 in the conservative ideology, and a lot of it has to do with this sort of like being a provider, father figure for family. and the idea that if you get to like putting your existential crisis at ease basically comes down to your ability to have sex, your ability for that sex to actually reproduce children rather than just being for your own gratification, and then you having enough money to pay for as many children as you want and provide them with a good future. So then, and because even if the world does go, we do have environmental problems, that because you will at least be the dominator who's on top and be on top of the power hierarchy, and that the whole idea of the heterosexual man is the idea that you're built to be like a machine, that this is what you do. You make money, you fuck, you reproduce, and you just repopulate the world with a lot of other little kids who are just good at this, and that for them, this is like they're evolved to the circumstances. So if the world is like an environmental hellhole, they just have a thick skin, right? They're going to be these like little kids who are going to be these like coal burner kids who are just going to fucking throw up these black fucking smokestacks out the back of their pickup trucks and, throw everybody the middle finger because they're fucking little maverick rebels who don't give a fuck about Doomerism because they ain't pussies, right? And so this becomes the brand of like male positivity, because if you can fucking reproduce, then it's the archetypal male is be able to get his erection, is be able to populate the earth with his seed, and that to not feel the need to do this is to be negative, to be cynical, to be defeatist, to be a little weak little bitch pussy. And it's sort of like, so you can, I'm being a bit sardonic, maybe you can tell, right? Because I don't really believe that, but this seems to be like, this is what it seems to be when we're talking about being positive versus being negative versus being a doomer versus like, why if I'm going to live a life I can live my life and feel like I'm not just pissing my life away doing something that I'm resentful about, but actually enjoying my experience living as much as I can. I'm not saying that like it's possible to enjoy everything, but if you're like why does that have to be linked into this thing about being like, can you be happy and not be so economically productive, or can you be happy and not be a consumer? Can you be happy? I mean, and then this whole thing, you don't want to like have to like be, you don't want to join the marketing team for austerity and tell everybody that we just need to accept austerity and we just need to accept poverty, and that we just and not try to make our situation better for us materially. But I don't know, like, I think that there's something about oftentimes our idea of material, what it takes to be prosperous in a material sense, is disconnected from the actual material reality that we're living with. Because I think that we live in a society of abundant excess to the point where it's maybe just flat up amoral. And in that context, if you can make a whole bunch of fucking waste product to finance your little, like, so you can reproduce all these little shithead children, and you want to call that being positive and being optimistic, well, I don't think it's really like, it's kind of like this, a very small kind of positivity, where if you get to feel good about yourself because you get to just have 7 kids and have enough money to do that, and confirm yourself as being a good guy because you have the agency to do that if you want to, and then you don't have any other concern for the well-being of what's going on in the world, you're just in this tunnel vision where daddy's got to eat, I gotta reaffirm myself as a good person, and that I'm daddy and I get to do good things, and I'm like, my little kids like me, like the more and that is like, you're just limited into that, and you're not looking at what's going on in the world. I don't like, it seems like and I'd rather be the doomer, man. Let's do it. Okay, so thanks for watching. I'm just trying to work out this is my reaction to the idea. Maybe it's a bit messy, maybe I'm going all over the place, but this is how it's coming out today. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more.